I'm going right now. Me too. Your headache might have to do with tension at the moment. Mm-hmm.
First of all, I'm not feeling all the minute on top of that, but it works.
Yeah.
I'm very easy.
Because he's very abnormally obsessed and needy, more than needing. And I told him that the other day. I said you're way over the top in the way you're relating to him. I didn't want to say exactly what I meant. I said it's not normal. Said, well, what's normal in this world? You're normal. Somebody else is normal.
Okay, there we go. This week's Parsha is a double Parsha, and I was very grateful for that fact because Acharimot did not have a lot of super juicy details, and it felt like it might be a little difficult.
It's one of the two Parshiyot this year.
And so instead, I thought we could look at something from Parshat Kedoshim, the second of the two Parshiot, which mostly is what we call the holiness code of ways to act. And there is an interesting pasuk with a commandment in it that I thought we could take a look at and think about how we interpret that pasuk and then how we think about classifying mitzvot in general. So let's see, I'll share the screen here. I'll make this a little bigger. The pasuk that caught my eye, and that of Rabbi Elchanan Samet, whose article I was reading, is from Vayikra Yud Tet, and it is Lo Tikalel Cheresh, don't insult the deaf, which we're going to sort of bifurcate and put aside from the pasuk. V'lifnei iver lo titein michshol. Vayareta me elokecha ani Hashem. So don't insult the deaf, okay? And don't place a stumbling block before the blind. You shall fear your God, I am the Lord. So has everyone here heard that phrase before? The lo titein lifnei iver lo titein michshol? And I wonder if anyone wants to share, like, what is the image that they picture in their mind of what the prohibition is there?
I know years ago, someone who was a scholar said, it does not mean literally not to put an obstacle in front of a blind person. It doesn't mean that. It means something general. It's so curious because the text is very simple and straightforward, and yet they say that's not the meaning that they give it.
Yes, amazing.
Yeah.
We're going to look at some of those more generalized, I would say, translations and talk about why they exist. I will say that maybe this is the product of my day school education, which I feel like I blame for many things in this class. But I always pictured it as opposed to Jerry's explanation as like not, putting a chair in the way of the path of someone who literally could not see, who was like legally blind, right? And it was a very physical, almost like slapstick, unfortunate kind of event that would transpire. But as we'll see, many like Jerry hold that it's much more complicated than that. So
the puzzle is why in the world they won't take it literally, but apparently they don't want to. Make it the literal translation be the basis of a more broader meaning, but they actually say that's not. If you put an obstacle in front of a blind person, this isn't what you've done. This isn't what they're talking about. It's something else. That's astonishing, but yet that is apparently a major reading of this.
I extended quite a ways. For instance, I would put misleading advertisement or misinformation given for political reasons.
Amazing.
Yeah, I would put those in that category. If the misinformation or the false advertising is given to people who don't have the education to understand the problem, then you're placing a stumbling block before them.
Amazing. So Tamar, we're going to see your read in the Sifra. You'll tell us which case you think sounds the most like the false advertising, but I love that. It's like straight out of the Sifra. I think that one piece, and it's one that I don't touch upon in our sources, Jerry, is that the Kutim, who were literalists, who were branching away, right, like the Samaritans, away from the more normative Jewish practice, they read this pasuk very literally. And so I think it's like sort of touched upon in this one article that I read, that some of the, not just saying it builds off of the literal meaning, but saying, no, that literal meaning is wrong, is based on that tension between the Kutim and the rest of Chazal. But I don't know a lot about it, and I'm not sure why specifically here that's what comes up. But that seems to be a piece, a historical piece to that puzzle. So right, so
But we do, I mean, we have examples of things that are not taken literally, like eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth is not literal either.
totally true. And I think that there are many places in Tanakh where we speak very figuratively, but that when it comes to like the actual mitzvah psukim, we tend to be a little bit more literalist.
Okay.
And so ayin tachat ayin is a good point because it does kind of fit into both, right? It's not an actual mitzvah, I don't think, but it certainly falls into the legal code sort of piece. It's not like, you know, a part of the storyline. So I agree with you. Not everything is read literally. Although there too, I bet that's like a branch off with the Kutim, right? Because there were cultures that did, right, cut off the hands of a thief or whatever it was. Right. So the first example, the first way of reading this is the most literal, right? A literal stumbling block in front of a literal blind person. But already by the Targum Unklus, we begin to see a broadening of the definition. So Unklus translated the Torah into Aramaic. And here he says, La tlut de la shama v'kadam de la chaze. And right, so don't insult those who do not hear or place something, we'll get to there, before someone who does not see. And the Targum certainly knew the words for deaf and blind in Aramaic, and yet he chose not to use them here, to write someone who doesn't hear or doesn't see, which I think suggests that Unklus maybe is saying it's not just someone who is like literally handicapped, legally considered blind. It's still a literal stumbling block, but maybe it's like if you had your eyes dilated at the ophthalmologist's, right, and you couldn't see very well, but you weren't blind. Or maybe, you know, someone who just woken up from a nap, like in the dark, and whose eyes were adjusting to the light, or someone who, I don't know, the sun was sort of blinding them, so they couldn't see at that moment, but you could see. That would all sort of count under Unklus's definition. So a small twist, right, away from the literal into the figurative, but a necessary one. And then the Sifra moves in the direction that Tamar was thinking about. The Sifra gives us 3 cases of a place where now the blindness and the stumbling block are both much more figurative, and it's like an intellectual blindness, and that the stumbling block is some sort of form of loss for the people, right? So he says, what are we talking about? Who is blind in this matter of before the blind man do not place a stumbling block? Well, if someone asks you, is that man's daughter fit for marriage into the priesthood, right? Bat ish ploni mahi kahuna. Right, so a matchmaker comes to you and says, hey, like my friend Eliezer the Kohen is looking for a wife. Do you think that Sarah, you know, daughter of whoever, is a good match for him? And if you know that she is a widow or a divorcee, or she had converted into Judaism, and you say, yeah, she's great for Eliezer, right? Causing Eliezer the Kohen then to marry someone that is not really eligible for his marriage, that would be an example of this case, right? So the person who is figuratively blind, right, intellectually blind, is the Kohen or the matchmaker, and you're giving information that will cause him to sin. Then the second case is if you are giving bad advice. Hino talmimach etzah al titain lo etzah she'ena hogenet lo, right? Don't give advice that is unfit for someone. And so what's the example? Someone was at your house and they say, hey, what's the best time to head out tomorrow on the road, right? Do not say leave early in the morning so that robbers should assault him. Right. I guess in the hashkama of the day, that's when the listim were waiting on the road. And so you wouldn't say, head out at 5. I think probably the equivalent in my mind is like, you wouldn't tell someone to leave at rush hour and give them a long delay. Don't tell them to leave in the afternoon so that they fall victim to the heat. Right. Similarly, don't tell them to leave at a bad time of day physically for them. And so here the intellectually blind person is the traveler, right? And you're giving them information that will either cause them to lose financially or physically. And then in the last instance, we come across someone who owns a field that you would like to buy. And you go to him and you say, hey, you should sell your field so that you have the money to buy a donkey. And then as soon as he sells his field, you reach in and snatch it up for yourself.
Kleenex.
And so here, of course, the intellectually blind person is the person who owns the land at first, and you have given misleading advice that might be financially beneficial for him, but certainly is an underhanded sale. Almost like, I don't know if they have this in Chicago, but apparently it's a big problem here in Philadelphia. There are signs all over the streets that say like, we buy houses for cash, right? And they convince people to sell out at a very low price, and then they flip the house and sell it for a much higher price in the city. So it seems sort of similar maybe to that. It's not a bad deal for them to get the house, but they're not getting the best deal. And the Sifra warns, don't say, but I gave him good advice. Like I didn't know, or I don't get hot. It's okay to say leave in the afternoon, because these things are known in your heart. Most masur lalev, and that somehow, right, God is not fooled. You can say you don't think it was a stumbling block, but really it was. So I think that Tamar's case really does fall in here somewhere, right? There's something sort of a little devious about it. I would say, right, in the first and the third case, it seems like you're tricking them for your benefit. And the middle case, it's like a little bit unclear why you're doing this. Rabbi Samit suggests that like this one is misguiding one for the sheer joy of watching another fail, which is a hard thing to think about, people doing, just, tricking someone for fun. But I would say that here the Sifra is stopping at Tamar's example. It's saying the blindness is intellectual, the stumbling block is the bad advice that you knowingly give to someone who doesn't know. But there are two cases, and we'll just look at one in the Gemara where they take this even further along. They bring the same breita in Avodah Zarah and in Psachim, and we're going to look at the one in Avodah Zarah. And here we're going to see a different kind of blindness being described. So they say minayin, right? How do we know this thing? This principle, shelo yoshit adam kos shel yain lenazir, ve'ever min achai livnei noach, right? So it says, how do we know that you should not give a cup of wine to a nazir who has taken a vow not to drink any wine, or to give a limb from a severed limb from a living animal to one of the bnei noach, because one of the sheva mitzvot bnei noach is not to eat ever min achai. How do you know you're not allowed to do that? Because the pasuk says, "V'lifnei iver lo titein michshol," because of this pasuk. And so here, presumably the Nazir, I think, I feel most comfortable saying the Nazir, but also maybe the Bnei Noach, know they're not supposed to do the thing that's being offered to them, right? When a Nazir becomes a Nazir, he takes a vow not to drink wine. So he's certainly not intellectually blind in the same way as the man with the field or the Kohen is above. And yet somehow the Gemara feels that there is maybe sort of a moral blindness going on here, almost akin to like offering an alcoholic a glass of wine, right? That like there's a moral corruption. And in fact, the Rambam describes it here. He lays out sort of a similar case, and he says, "V'chein kol hamachshil iver b'davar v'hasio etza she'ena hogenet lo hogenet o shehizek yidei ovrei avera shehu iver ve'eno ro'ed derech ha'emet mipnei ta'avat libo." Right, so giving misdirection to anyone who is blind, or giving him bad advice, or encourages a criminal who is blind, right? And how do we describe it here? He cannot see the way of truth because of his greedy lust, right? So the robber is blind morally, not intellectually, right? And so perhaps the Nazir who so wants this glass of wine, you're like playing on his taiva, right, for wine that he hasn't had in months or years by now. And so that's leading him astray. And in fact, in the Rambam Sefer HaMitzvot, when he talks about the commandments that come from this pasuk in negative commandment 299, he also talks about this idea of including one who helps another to do a sin or enables it. Because he seduces, right? It's such a strong word. He seduces the sinner and helps him to complete his sin. Right? So the Nazir says, I know that I love wine, so I'm not going to have any in my house. And my friends know that I have taken this Nazirut vow for 6 months, and so they won't offer me wine at a party. And yet the Rambam is imagining that this person who puts the michshol before an iver is actually saying, no, come on, like I'm going to seduce you, smell the wine, it's so good, right? Like come back, come have a drink. And that is causing this blindness for the Nazir or anyone in that situation. So I think that, like Jerry said, this is shocking, right? The Rambam is like a pretty mainstream interpreter of the mitzvot, and for him to read so much into the story is sort of surprising, right? The first paragraph of the Rambam about the Sifra makes maybe a little bit of sense, like to say that it's just metaphorical, but to really make that jump to say it's not just metaphorical, but it's also like this other aspect of metaphorical about a moral blindness, not just an intellectual blindness, I think is surprising. And I read this beautiful article in this new book from my mom for my bat mitzvah anniversary, where what he says is that there are a few reasons why Chazal might be tempted to do this, right? And the first is that if you take the text at its literal translation, it sounds like a very mean-hearted thing to warn against, right? Don't place like a physical item in front of someone who will trip and fall because they can't see. And it kind of reminds me of like when I yell at my kids, like, I shouldn't have to tell you not to kill ants, right? Or not to sit on each other and pull your hair out. Like that should be understood that that's not appropriate behavior. And so I think Chazal was troubled that the Torah was, what did I tell my kids? What do my kids do that's terrible? I shouldn't have.
I was just worried that I shouldn't kill ants.
Oh, maybe when they're in your house, but like, I don't know, my son, like, he likes to like look at them and then like grind them with a rock outside.
Oh, it's mostly in the house.
Yeah, in the house, totally fair game. They
Okay.
enter. I love those little traps, and they bring their poison back to their friends. I'm just as vicious in my house as the next guy. I don't know, pull the legs off spiders, something like sort of over the top, right? Signs of serial killer future for your child. And so I think it troubled Chazal that they would have to address such poor conduct. And so making it about either intellectual or moral blindness feels like a little bit less clear. That's like hazier territory. That's worthy of the negative commandment. So that resonated with me, but I think that, like you were saying earlier, Debbie, like there are plenty of places where we also warn against terrible things, and we don't seem as concerned about the moral conduct of the audience. But I do understand the concern, because certainly it does seem sort of icky to think that people like were all ready to go tripping their blind neighbors until the Torah reminded them that was wrong. But also, as Debbie mentioned, the Torah is often metaphorical in its use of words. So Rabbi Samet did the research, and the word iver, the blind person in our pasuk, appears 26 times in Tanakh, and an additional 5 times in the verb form, vaya'aver, to blind someone. And in at least 10 of these instances, it is used metaphorically. So that is another good key, right? It's like a tool, once you have the will to move it along, to say, oh, well, actually, maybe like there's a good precedent for this. So a lot of those cases are in Isaiah, which to me is like a little bit less of a good point, because again, this is like a sort of mitzvah language as opposed to a more, narrative. But there is one really nice example that I brought here from Devarim, where it seems to be very similar. And this is talking about judgment and good rulings, right? Lo tatem mishpat, lo takir panim. Don't judge unfairly and don't show partiality. V'lo tikach shochad, and don't take bribes. Ki hashochad ye'aver einei chachamim v'yisalef divrei tzadikim. Because bribes blind the eyes of the discerning and upset the plea of the just. So this obviously is not saying that anyone is like gouging out the eyes of the judge, but it's using it in a much more metaphorical sense. And so it seems as though it's the right, it's a fair way for Chazal to read it in the context of the broader terms, right? 26 times, 10 of which are metaphorical. Well, really 31 when you count the V'yavers, which this is one of, right? Seems like not a bad track record. And so then the question is, why choose this way, right? You could obviously choose either route as Chazal. And this brings us back to this idea of mitzvah counting, which I find fascinating. In the time of the Rambam, there was a sort of a race to figure out which mitzvot were counted in the 613 and how you counted and classified them, right? Because there are many more possibilities for mitzvot than just 613 in the Torah. And so the Sefer HaChinuch and the Sefer HaMitzvot and the Ramban and many others would argue over what counted as a mitzvah and what counted sort of subsumed under the category of a different mitzvah. And so here, allowing for a metaphorical read that allows for both intellectual and moral blindness gives the Rambam a chance to tuck away 2 mitzvot under the headline of 1, which is a very valuable thing when you're counting mitzvot. And I think what I found so appealing about this whole idea, this whole article, an argument that I put forth, is that I always thought of like the mitzvot as very static, like from Matan Torah down to today. But I think that this very much highlights that there was like an art to the classification of mitzvot in a time, only the Rambam died in like the 1200s. So, right, only 1,000 years ago, there was still like a very active role in thinking about how the mitzvot should be defined and what got counted under each category. And it gave them a lot of artistic license to really put values forward, right? If the Rambam had stuck to just the blind person and the stumbling block, he would have lost his opportunity to say, hey, these are really important values. And I think that on a less broad level, I love mitzvot that I think are so clear cut from like 3rd grade. And then I discover like the Sifra and Avodah Zarah, those are like pretty, canonical sources that I never learned. And so it opened my eyes to thinking about this in another way. But I welcome thoughts and other ideas.
Well, as a kid, I can't remember the exact example, but it would be like you park your car, leave the door open with your keys in it so somebody could steal it. You're encouraging the sin by not being careful.
Interesting. I like that. I thought you were going in a slightly different direction. I'm honored that I said something though that got you to show your face, Barry. I thought that you were going to say it was like how the police have to walk that sort of fine line where like you can, and I only know all my information from like you know, police Law and Order shows, but right, like you can't entrap the person into committing a crime, but you can walk really close to that line of misleading them, right? Maybe it would like fall a little bit into this category, asking someone if they want to, you know, do whatever illegal action. And there are only like small rules. That's it. You know, you can't say you're a police officer or whatever it is. No, sorry, you can't say you're not a police officer if they ask you. But I like your example better, Barry, because it shows how easy it is to do this accidentally, right? The Sifra like it's a sneaky set of examples, but your example is about just being careful, that our actions are important even when they're thoughtless. They can lead to bad things.
I think it's more than just a counting thing, by the way. I think that these are important concepts, and which other mitzvah that's written in the Torah are they going to learn this from? And there isn't really another that I know of. So if they really do consider it, well, it is considered, you know, Torah Sinai, then they have to learn it from here because there's nowhere else. Otherwise, it's just like, otherwise it gets reduced to, well, everyone should know you shouldn't put blocks in front of a blind person and have them fall. It's a way to sort of overtly say it, because otherwise people will run around giving wrong information about politics and people will vote for the wrong person.
Yes. Yes, I think that's totally true. I think that, right, this is the D'Oraita level that we're talking about. And you're right that to get that, that level of authority, it makes sense that this is the direction they went, because they had to find some like, you know, authoritative D'Oraita statement under which to stick it. And certainly this is worth being a D'Oraita level.
Yeah, I was impressed by the end of this paragraph when it says, lest you say, but I gave him good advice. Well, you can say, no, I had good intentions. I didn't mean to harm him, but, and concludes, but these things are known to the heart. In other words, you know better. Don't try to fool me. Don't try to fool yourself. And you shall fear your God, Ani Hashem. So I think this is the beginning of conscience. This is the beginning of responsibility. I can't get away from this. I can't fool everybody, but I can even fool myself. But there is one entity that I cannot fool, and I better see what I'm doing. This vicious as the cycle goes on. So I was really. Let me ask you, when it says you shall fear your God, is fear? I don't know Hebrew. I can. Is that, does it mean fear or awe? Because those two things sometimes are mixed up. I'm asking you.
I think that yirah is mostly fear and not awe, but I could look into that.
How does it say in Hebrew?
I think you could use yirah for fear today. Right, and that it's nice. I love the midrashim that manage to tie both parts of the pasuk together. Right? Why does it say at the end of this pasuk, like dafka, this mitzvah of the stumbling block, you shall fear your God? It's because it's so easy to pretend that you haven't done this, and so only God knows. Right? That's the only one that you'll ultimately fear for these consequences. Very nice.
And on the simple level, you don't have to fear the blind person seeing you put it there.
Yes. Yes. Right. But why not fear your neighbor or that, right?
Well, presumably, sort of like mothers telling their children not to pull the legs off of spiders. If the neighbors see you putting a chair in front of the blind person, they'll say, don't do that. So maybe that's why.
Yeah. Yes, but certainly that comes up a lot with the insulting those who do not hear. Is there's like something particularly offensive about doing something to someone who won't know about it. And I think that that's definitely a piece of it. Yeah, it certainly, it highlights the tendencies, whether it's just leaving your keys in the car and the door open, or actively selling someone some kind of story so that they can win an election that they don't deserve. There's like a human tendency in there, and it's easy to justify, right? And I think that's what the Sifra is catching is, don't say, oh, but I don't get hot in the middle of the day, so I said they could go on their hike and they got heat stroke. Like, you really didn't like them and you wanted them to suffer. You know, you have to own your actions and their consequences. And,
Let the buyer beware is not one of our concepts.
that's right. That's right.
I find most impressive about passages like this is that we're told that God wants us to behave ethically toward one another. In so many other places in the Torah too, we're told this is what God wants you to do. And I'm not a student of religions, but I wonder which other religions would have God wishing mankind to behave ethically toward one another. Certainly not the pagan religions. I don't think Zeus or any of the other Greek or Roman gods were concerned with people's level of morality toward one another.
Yeah.
But I don't know about other religions.
It's interesting, right? Like the other sort of, the Iver falls maybe under the same categories like the widow and the orphan and the convert, right? Like people who we are told to be kind to, but I think it's this ethical piece that feels distinct and different to this pasuk, as opposed to showing kindness, right? I know certainly in Christianity, that is like a very popular warning to be kind to those who are disadvantaged, but the ethical piece is an interesting one. I don't know.
Mhm.
It does feel special.
I wonder if they're compelled to speculate about how to read this because of the yad tachat yad, that they felt forced to not read it directly, but read it very indirectly. Perhaps because of that, they felt to be consistent, they had to not take something that looks pretty obvious what its meaning is and still not accept it. Yad tachat yad startles people. This
Yeah.
one doesn't startle people at all. It seems very, very proper.
Yeah. Well, and there's a nice literary connection between ayin tachat ayin, as Debbie said at the beginning, and the blind person, right? Because I think that is a quote from Chazal, right? Like if we took out everybody's eye, we would all be blind, right? And so there's something sort of like a justice to that. If we lived in a society like that, we would have to worry about actual blind people. But because we live in a society where we don't blind people for mistakes, we're talking about other kinds of blindness here. Great. Well, wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom filled with sight and ethical behavior, and I will see you next week. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you, Yael. Thank you.
Shabbat shalom.
Thank you. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Bye, Barry.